Hello, this is your host Emily at Voice of the Voiceless, Speak Your Truth. This podcast is on miserable babies and unsettled babies, and in particular the relation to infant feeding. So our guest today is Maureen Minchin. Maureen, she had 3 children in the 1970s, and her experience of breastfeeding and of allergies and intolerances in babies sent her on a life-changing journey, and she now provides advice and support to families experiencing allergies, and also to improve the education of health professionals in this area. She is now a medical historian and health educator. She's involved in global efforts to promote evidence-based infant feeding. She's been doing this for decades. She's a consultant to the World Health Organization and the United Nations Children's Fund. She's also a founding member of the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action Research Task Force. So Maureen has written a few books. So the first one is Milk Matters, Infant Feeding and Immune Disorder. So in this podcast, Maureen references this quite a bit. She's also written another book called Food for Thought, A Parent's Guide to Food Intolerance and Breastfeeding Matters. So Maureen also recommends Joy Anderson's book, Food Sensitive Babies. Joy Anderson is a dietitian and also a lactation consultant who also works in this area. She focuses on food sensitivity in babies, and in particular breastfed babies. This podcast I recorded on Zoom with Maureen, so I did this a few days ago. It's quite a long podcast. I think it took about 2 hours to record. So if anyone has a baby or a young child, especially if that baby is breastfed and they suspect that they have an allergy, this is a really, really good resource, a really good place to start to educate yourself and your family about what might be happening and the reasons behind it. And also, even if your baby is formula fed, this is really helpful. So Maureen has extensive knowledge in breastfeeding and formula feeding. Hi Maureen, welcome to Voice of the Voiceless.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for coming and being a guest on our show today. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about unsettled and miserable babies. To start with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a mother and grandmother now, and 40 plus years ago I was simply a confused first-time mother with a baby who didn't stop crying, didn't sleep, vomited, had all sorts of problems one way and another. So that's where I came from, and along the way I've done an awful lot of reading and writing and educating of health professionals about this, right up to the level of being a consultant for WHO in relation to issues of infant feeding. So all those mothers out there who are struggling should realise that this may be the beginning of a pathway to somewhere quite different from where they thought they were going in their lives. It certainly was for me.
Yeah. So when you say WHO, does that mean who?
The World Health Organization, yep. Sorry. Yep.
That's okay. I just wanted to clarify that. So can you tell us a little bit about why babies do cry?
Well, babies cry because it's their only way to signal that they need something. And the something that they need can be anything from more food to less of a particular food, which is what we'll be talking about mostly today. And that's really part of the problem. Mothers have to learn to understand what their baby's saying when they're crying, and hopefully to have a baby that doesn't cry very much, as indeed my subsequent babies didn't.
So when you're saying it might be a signal to eat less of a particular food, can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, of course, you work out when you've got a crying baby, you try to eliminate the simplest things as you go through. You go through the main causes of unsettled babies. Are they hungry? Are you, if you're a breastfeeding mum, do you actually have an oversupply of milk? And this is very common nowadays, where women are busy pumping rather than just simply adapting to their one child's need from the very beginning. It might be too much milk, and that in itself can cause a lactose overload. Too much of the sugar in milk can actually cause some gut symptoms. We'll talk a bit about that later.
Yep.
It can be a medical problem. It can be tongue tie. It can, at the end of the day, be food allergy. And that is much more common than people know.
Yep.
We've been saying this as parents since the 1970s, when it first became obvious that, in fact, children were being made sensitive to cow's milk by giving it to them in hospital. 1 or 2 feeds of formula was enough to cause a lifetime of suffering for my son and many other children. So you come to considering food sensitivity or food allergy at the end of a process of saying, well, it's not that, let's look and see what it might be, rather than rushing into, oh, my friend found it was cow's milk, so I'm going to avoid cow's milk, or something similar, which you should never do unless you've got some reason for thinking that it's the actual cause of the baby's misery. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that.
Okay. Interesting. Because, yeah, I know, and I'm in a fantastic Facebook support group about breastfed babies who have allergies and intolerances. So there's lots of support there. And it seems to be a very common thing there, where a lot of the members, like you said, they come in and they have no idea what it's about, but it's not very recognised that food allergy is a common
no, even
cause.
now, 40 years on, the doctors are still telling mothers that it's uncommon, when in actual fact, if they had been paying attention to parents, they would have recognised it was a growing problem from the 1970s on. Allergists will say it's only just happened, where we're seeing this big rise. The rise has been there ever since the 1960s, when infant formula companies started giving infant formula to hospitals in handy little packages that could be used, and hospitals started exposing virtually every baby. By the mid-1970s, virtually every baby in Australia was being exposed to infant formula in hospital, even if they were going to go on and be exclusively breastfed afterwards, as my son was.
Yep.
And nobody had any idea that that was so creating problems for the development of the gut microbiome, that balance of you might say, the jungle that lives inside us, so many competing organisms
Yep.
that are there. Nobody had any idea, although the science was there to say so, but the people doing it had no idea that they were in fact causing a problem that was now going to show up not just in that generation, like my son, but in the children of that generation, particularly when it was a woman whom they had made sensitive, because she's the person who is going to gestate and bear that next generation.
Yep.
And what we're seeing now, and why it's so severe now, is because these babies are being born out of the bodies of mothers who were themselves made sensitive. Many of them don't realise that. And many breastfeeding mothers find that when they change their diet so as to end the crying of their baby, they lose symptoms that they didn't even recognise as symptoms that they lived with all their lives. So that we're looking now at an intergenerational transmission of problems, which depends not just on the mother, but also on the father. If he's been made sensitive, there are ingredients that can appear in his sperm, microRNAs can be present in his sperm, which can actually affect the development of the fetus. And so his genetic inheritance and what he gives to the development of the baby will also affect it. And that goes back for 2 generations. It's at least 2 generations that we're looking at now. And so the mother who's struggling with a crying baby now is not responsible for that. What has happened, she's a victim of what's been done in the past to grandparents and parents on both sides. Still there? Yeah. Okay. it goes right back to parents and grandparents and what happened to them as children, how they've lived their lives. All of that is something that will affect this generation. So mothers now...
It's cut out again.
They, in fact, are the victims of a historical process that, in fact, began a long time ago. And their child and they and their children are suffering as a consequence of other people's actions in the past, which can't be undone and which we just have to live with and try to improve the outcomes about in the future.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've never heard that from that perspective, going back into the generations and how what's happened to one generation will go on and affect the next.
Yes, it's implicit in all the science. Will tell you this if you really read the science.
Yeah.
But of course, many doctors don't read the science. The most that they read are the promotional blurbs from companies selling products that are said to improve this particular issue. Many of which don't have that effect for many children.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the main point to get across for mothers is they are not guilty of anything. It isn't because they're incompetent mothers or they're not handling their babies right. Much of their baby's gut distress is due to factors that are outside their control that actually are probably affecting them as well if they're a breastfeeding mother whose baby is upset. Because we've got to realise crying babies are actually not usual in many communities where people have not interfered with the natural process of feeding. Yeah. If they do cry, they're seen as needing something and they're immediately picked up and comforted and they stop crying. Now, we don't live in that kind of society. We live in a society where mothers are told not to spoil the child by picking them up, telling them to self-settle and things like this. And that, of course, only makes everything much worse for the baby.
This is so true. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the misconceptions about colic? You've gone into a little bit.
Yeah, well, colic has always happened to all animals. You know, if a horse gets colic, a severe colic, they're very likely to look at killing it because the pain is so intense. And that's something that I think we don't realise. If a baby has got gut distress of that kind, it really is incredibly painful. Once they're old enough to talk and tell you about it, they'll tell you how extreme the pain can be. So you do have abdominal distress, which can be labelled colic. But the problem in Western societies is that colic has been applied to explain a phenomenon that really was probably once relatively benign, and I've described this in the book. Classic colic, as it was described, was that 6 o'clock evening crying from then till about 10, and then the baby would go to sleep, would sleep okay, would wake up the next morning and be happy all day, but start crying again in the evening. That isn't the pattern we see now. Classic colic of that kind is not what we're talking about. We're talking about babies who are hard to settle from the day they're born in many cases, and who are miserable unless they're being held upright against a warm body to comfort them. And even then they can be intractably crying if the pain is severe enough. Now, that is not a normal pattern for babies. The human race wouldn't have got as far as it did if we had babies that were that unhappy. Apart from anything else, in prehistoric times, they would have signalled to all the animals that were trying to eat us where to find us. So it's not something that I see as normal. A crying baby is a baby in distress. Distress should always be treated seriously. And if that means that the baby needs to be picked up and carried and held by other people and sleep with other humans, as is normal for humans right around the world, except in Western communities, then that's what you need to do. You need to do whatever you can to reduce the crying, because that in itself makes everything worse. The stress hormones that are being liberated mean that the child is actually less able to cope with the allergens that are probably circulating in their system, causing these kinds of problems and distress. So my idea of colic is basically not one thing. It's whatever causes a baby to cry, and we need to work out what that one thing is and deal with it.
So what you're saying is that colic or inconsolable crying in babies is really